everybody, and welcome to this Platform Futures roundtable discussion hosted by the Digital Asia Hub. For those of you not familiar, the Digital Asia Hub is an internet and society think tank based in Hong Kong, where we look at the implications for technology and society across Asia. Our Platform Futures initiative is something we started in 2020, where we wanted to look at and create a network of experts and create a space for dialogue and discourse around the governance of technology platforms here in the Asia Pacific. We've got today's roundtable discussion where we're going to be looking at the question of disinformation and misinformation on social media platforms. I know many of you tuning in work on these issues from a variety of different countries. We have a really fun and engaging and panel discussion planned for you. Just one housekeeping note. Unfortunately, our fourth speaker, Nigad, had to drop out at the very last minute due to a family emergency. So we won't have Nigad join us for the panel. However, we have Nurma, Chris, and Wolfgang with promises to make for a really engaging discussion. And just a final housekeeping note before we start again. For all of those you joining, please keep yourself on mute. And we will have about some 15 minutes at the end for a chance for an audience Q&A. How we'll run the event today is each of the speakers will have about 5 to 7 minutes for opening remarks, and then we'll have a moderated discussion followed by an audience Q&A towards the end. We've received many of your questions already during the sign up in the registration page. So we'll raise some of those questions as well in the audience Q&A. So with that, I'm going to start the opening remarks section. And our first speaker will be Dr. Wolfgang Schulz, who is the research director at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society based in Berlin. Wolfgang is a close collaborator and friend of the Digital Asia Hub and works on a number of different issues. And Wolfgang, we would love to hear your view from the EU and from Germany around these new disinformation-related regulations that are being associated with the Digital Services Act that are coming into force very soon. We'd love to hear more about sort of that experience coming from Berlin and how you see that implementation coming through.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. I'm very happy to share the European perspective, and thanks so much to the Digital Asia Hub and Defue and Malavika especially for bringing us together here. I try to be brief. That's not so easy because we have a lot of regulation in Europe. As you might remember, we have this very odd situation that we have this national level and the European level of regulation, sometimes competing with each other, one learning from the other. We'll hear that in a minute when we talk about the Digital Services Act. I would start with a brief remark on the national level. And that's not always a very, very encouraging story in Europe, I would say. Many of you will know that we have some countries in Europe that introduce specific regulation on disinformation. And the Hungarian bill specifically on health misinformation during the COVID crisis is one of those examples. And there's an example at least in two ways. One is it's a law that really is linking the punishable offense to the statement being false or not false. So we have this truth-untruth distinction here. It's not about distribution patterns or other things, but it's really about the statement being correct or not, and also about distorted information, which is of course a flexible term, and many criticize that as being highly problematic in terms of misuse by by government authorities. And when you do not have independent courts, then that might end up in something really, really problematic for freedom of speech. The EU level is more heavily discussed lately, very, very briefly on that. Two instruments that are interesting. One is a really binding instrument that has been enacted last year and will come into force step by step until February of 2024, and the Code of Practice on disinformation. The famous, could say notorious, Digital Services Act of the EU. If you want to get an understanding of the concept, then I think one interesting element is that it does not define what disinformation is. It refers to illegal content, and even illegal content is not defined in the Digital Services Act, but it refers to the national definitions of legal and illegal content. Coming back to Hungary, that means that this kind of content that is deemed illegal in Hungary is something that can be now enforced under the concept that the DSA is constructing, and that is being built right now as we speak. And the companies are working on implementation of the DSA. So that is something you might already see that I'm not a big fan of the DSA. Will come some good out of it, I'm sure, but there are some downsides as well. And the regulatory concept is, again, we do not look at an individual piece of content under the DSA, but it's all about structures and procedures. It's about effective complaint mechanisms that platforms have to establish. There is a system how trusted flaggers can be accredited by national coordinators that are the regulators under the DSA that we now have to set up. In Germany, it's a big fight who should be the coordinator. Different entities want to be that because they see will be an important duties to be fulfilled. There is data access for researchers, something which I think is important because the knowledge base plays a role. There's an interesting element here that we call hybrid regulation, that is that the DSA acknowledges that there is a level of private regulation, community standards, and wants to influence how companies act on their own private rules, and want to force them to recognize the users' freedoms. That's freedom of speech, obviously, but it's also freedom for academic research that can play a role. Here we are working on that. And there is the obligation to have a risk assessment, as also would include to see, does a specific service element trigger disinformation, and what harm can flow out of that, and what could be mitigating measures. And code of conduct efforts that have been already a tradition in Europe are included in the concept as well. That brings me to the last point, and that's the code of conduct, code of practice on disinformation. That is something that the European Commission, which is the kind of acting entity, some say in inverted commas, the government of the EU, what they have as a kind of concept I have been using for a while, and that is trying to get in negotiation with the industry and have them set up some rules voluntarily, and monitor then how that works. And when it does not work, then some stricter measures might be enacted. That's an effective, but also I think a little bit dangerous element, because sometimes governments and the European Commission are tempted to try things out by convincing the industry that they could not enact in a law because maybe it's too tough, too much restricting speech. So we have to have I think, a very careful look at how that unfolds. And because my time is over, I think I will not go into every point here, but I think the list is impressive and shows that when you want to fight disinformation, and at least in Europe, people believe that you have to use a lot of different tools. You have to see what kind of disinformation can be effectively dealt with by demonetization, because people just want to get money out of it. Some others are not interested in money because they want to influence political processes, and then demonetization is not really a good instrument. Then you need others, and so that's why these list of different measures has been implemented here, and in regular reports you can see how companies are implementing that and how they proceed. So that was my input from a European perspective, a little bit too long, but I hope it was interesting anyway, and looking forward to hearing what the others bring to the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. That was really informative and a really nice overview on what's happening in Europe, and I'm sure we'll dive deeper into some of the details in the discussion. Next, I'm going to invite Nurma, who's joining from Jakarta. Nurma has done a lot of work on the question of media and rules for platforms, especially in Indonesia. And Nurma, I will let you share your slides and have your opening remarks start. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Dev. Hello, my name is Nurma Fitrianingrum, and I'm from Indonesia. Today, I'll be presenting about the regulation trends on moderation of misinformation and disinformation contents in Indonesia. So the regulation in Indonesia, so spreading false information is a criminal offense in Indonesia. And yes, we don't have the term of misinformation or disinformation, but it's spreading false information. And according to the criminal code law, it's one of the offense. And even though this regulation just revised last year, actually the original law, which dates back to 1946, already mentioned about this clause. And later, the government also enacted Electronic and Information Transaction Law, EAT law, specifically regulates the distribution of false information on the internet. Based on this regulation, misinformation or disinformation contents could be requested to be removed from social media or platforms because they violate the existing laws in Indonesia. And in 2020, the Ministry of Communication and Informatics, MOCI, they came with a very technical regulation about content moderation, which is they don't use the term of false or false information again, but here they use prohibited contents as a whole. The next one is about the prohibited content in Indonesia. So according to this regulation, the prohibited contents are defined as contents that fall at least into one of these following classification. And I will maybe focus more on the classification, which is creates public disturbance and disturb public order. In my opinion, this is very problematic because it leaves a wide gray area with risk of multi-interpretation from different interest groups, and many civil society organizations as well as activists in Indonesia has been criticizing this term and this regulation. They are afraid that this clause especially will be used or misused by the ruling government to limit the freedom of speech, as well as limiting civic space, which is already systematically shrunken from many directions in Indonesia right now, especially since 2019. According to this law, the procedure for removal of prohibited content, actually public as well as government institution can report any content that they believe to be false and or to be prohibited for especially to the Mochi. However, the public has to report first to any government agency, and from the report they submitted, Mochi, the Ministry of Communication and Informatics, they make the decision by themselves about the content, which whether the content is prohibited or not, misinformation or not, and by that they will order platform to remove the content, and platform only has 4 hours for urgent content related to terrorism, child pornography, as well as content that disrupt public order, which is very problematic, and 24 hours. If they fail to remove those contents, the government will file administrative fines. And if they still fail to remove, they will order the internet service provider to block access to those platforms. This is quite a direct order from the government, from the Mochi itself, without any court process. Actually, there are a lot of problems with this regulation, but I think I will focus on the lack of proper due process and the deliberative decision making, because here Mochi is the only actor, stakeholder who will make decision, and there is no mechanism for accountability or transparency, or even the both the one who posted or the platform cannot appeal the decision from Mochi. And in this regulation, Mochi only limits moderation to content takedown only. So in the regulation itself, it's only written takedown. There is takedown, and there is no other options such as demonetizing, warning users, or depublishing, or also demuting the content. The last but not least, the government put very unrealistic time frames for the removal, especially the 4 hours limit for urgent material, and we actually don't know how they decide between urgent and non-urgent disinformation or prohibited contents in Indonesia, and the term it's very gray. Even a lot of platform companies, they rejected or protested about this clause, because it's very hard for them, especially for international tech companies, where they need to coordinate with the headquarters to make a decision that's unclear within their specific company's regulation. And this is the data of the content moderated by platforms in Indonesia. Facebook is actually the only one who lists the data of misinformation removal requested by the government of Indonesia, especially from Mochi. And during COVID pandemic, actually, Mochi has requested Meta to remove thousands of COVID-19 and vaccination disinformation contents from their platform. This is apart from the restriction access that Meta has already self-imposed. So the government of Indonesia has been actively requesting the takedown contents, and also within Facebook, Indonesia is among the top country where there is from the government and from the public to request content removal from Google. But my closing statement, it will be to show that Indonesia is one of the cases where platforms limited transparency about content moderation finally met with a very repressive regulation, in my opinion, and lack of accountability from the government, that it's, for me, it's even really hard to find what kind of content removal that actually the government requested so far from platforms. Yeah, that's my introduction for the issue of moderation in Indonesia.
Thank you, Nurma. That was really informative view from Indonesia, and to learn about Mochi and how that's evolving. And we'll dive further into the discussion. Next, I'll introduce our third speaker, Chris Fei Shen. He is the associate head at the City University of Hong Kong, and Chris has done a lot of work around fact-checking and how exposure to fact-checking on social media can influence misinformation perception. So I think we'd love to hear more from Chris on this issue. And so with that, Chris, I'll turn over the mic to you.
Okay, thank you, Dave, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Steph have already introduced, my research is mostly about empirical effects of fact-checking. I've done some studies in the past few years with my students on this topic. Because I'm not a law and regulation scholar, and my personal opinion is laws and regulations, to some extent, you can limit the amount of problematic content online, but at the end of the day, it's about people. So I believe study audience and empower citizens to some extent is more important than restricting what they can see and what they cannot see. So first of all, a disclaimer on this. This project on social media's fact-checking effects was funded by Facebook Research Award. But the research process is totally independent. I can start with a little bit background of Hong Kong situation, the context of Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to be free from misinformation problem, other than a few, celebrity, those related misinformation. But in the past 10 years, Hong Kong, the problem of misinformation, disinformation is more obvious. To some extent, this is really related to the political environment. After the Occupy Central movement in 2014, the political camps on two sides become more and more, the animosity between them become more intense, and therefore misinformation becomes a weapon that the two camps use to attack each other. So accompanying the process of misinformation, there is also a general trend of political attitude polarization in Hong Kong up to 2014. And this trend kind of reached peak at 2019. I guess everyone knows what happened in 2019. Basically, the anti-extradition bill movement is the peak of this attitude polarization. And misinformation and political polarization are always criticized because of the role of social media play in this process. So my empirical project is interested in whether if social media can be used to spread misinformation and disinformation, is it possible that we can make use of the power of social media to counteract those negative effects? So an interesting phenomenon that happened in Hong Kong after Occupy Central movement is the rise of fact-checking culture. There are a number of fact-checking, non-partisan fact-checking organizations in Hong Kong. Some are funded by media organizations. Some are, funded by universities like Hong Kong Baptist University. So last year I did a small experiment, just to longitudinal experiment to find out if people are constantly exposed to fact-checking information, will they change their attitude and correct their misinformation perception? So the design of this longitudinal experiment survey is kind of complicated. I don't want to go into the details, but anyway, we collect data on different waves and measure people's use of media, and we assign people randomly into different conditions. Some are assigned into control groups, some are assigned into a group where we constantly feed them health-related misinformation fact-checking. Some are fed with political fact-checking. Okay, so in the end, a very quick share of the research findings, preliminary research findings, we found out that exposure to fact-checking basically cannot change people's political attitude, but it can slightly reduce affective polarization and political polarization as well. To some extent, it can also help correct misperception. The other thing we investigated related to fact-checking is about partisan bias, because even if fact-checking organizations can be professional in terms of their fact-checking effort, but still in terms of selecting the topics to fact-check, there's a partisan bias. We find out different organizations in Hong Kong. And interestingly, we also designed three conditions actually. Condition A is the pro-government fact-checking. Condition B is the pro-democracy side of fact-checking. And then we also designed a balanced fact-checking condition. So as we expected, we found out people who are expected to balanced fact-checking condition will achieve the best effect in terms of misinformation correction. So if people are constantly fed with one-sided fact-checking, there also could be some problem. Okay? So these are some of the preliminary findings I want to share as an opening, and then I look forward to discussing this topic with you further. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for sharing your work on fact-checking and social media platforms coming in from Hong Kong. Great. With that, we'll move into our moderated discussion section, during which Wolfgang and the rest of the participants will be on the virtual panel, so to speak. And we will then have an audience Q&A section right after that. So that I'll turn over the mic to you, Wolfgang.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I have the pleasure to kick this conversation up, and I will start with a follow-up to you, Nurma, because I'd like to better understand the system. Could you elaborate a little bit on how platforms are held accountable in this system on content moderation? Would be interested in learning more about that.
Yeah, actually, according to the regulation of MOCHI number 5, platform should be responsible for the contents that's on their space. So they should be proactively cleaning or debunking misinformation and disinformation, but also in a lot of cases, the government directly requested them to remove certain contents that they deem as misinformation and disinformation. And in a lot of cases, I ask friends who work for those platforms, actually they are more like following the government order here. And because of we have quite strict government, but I also found the data that actually the kind of the average of those social medias, the rates they follow those orders are like between 50%. So there is still room for them to challenge the government decision, but it's harder for the people who posted those materials and got removed, because they can only challenge after the removal and not during the decision-making process.
Okay, now I better understand. What would your view be? So one of the obvious question, I think, is that we have been in the process of thinking about systems to deal with the disinformation problem. How does it work to link systems to a judgment of the statement being true or false? And as I've demonstrated in the European system, it's much about structures, procedures, and things like that. And they a little bit shy away from the decision on what disinformation actually is. And there might be some value in that. But they are systems and some national states, as demonstrated in Europe, that really say there has to be a judgment whether that's is true or false. And what would, Nurma, your take would be after having studied the system in your country? Does it work? Where are the problems? Is it really a feasible approach to really to make decisions about the statements? Because we all know language is ambiguous and things like that. What are your views on that? Because I think that's for the future, how we proceed really makes a difference.
Yeah. In my opinion, this is kind of like very unfair, and I will not suggest anyone to follow what Indonesia is doing right now, even though when I asked a friend who worked from the ministry, MOCHI, they said that actually in the decision-making process, the government involves also fact-checking organizations, but we never really know about how they make the decision, like the process, because so far there is no transparency report from the government about what kind of content that they actually requested the platforms to remove, and yeah. A lot of civil society organization here actually also suggested the approach that the EU already initiated about like working together between platforms and then the government organization, civil society organization, and media to make a national platform council or something like that to really solve the problem of misinformation and not just solely rely on the government decision, because with the situation of political situation in Indonesia right now, it's I don't want to say it's close to authoritarian, but yeah, we are going to that way. So yeah, we need to a bit control or limiting the control of the government.
Yeah. Thank you for this frank remarks. I personally remember that when the Network Enforcement Act in Germany was coming into effect, some people might remember that was one of the first laws enacted worldwide on specifically mandating social media companies to come up with an complaints mechanism that is capable of deleting content in 24 hours if it's manifestly illegal. And I've been to Indonesia at that time, and the government was really interested in this law. I remember that. That's oh, that's interesting. That's something we might want to implement in a similar way. And that brings us back to these question that the same set of rules can mean completely different things in different political and cultural contexts. Also talked about that in Hungary example, and if the court system is maybe not completely independent, then courts checking these kind of things can be problematic.
Yeah, actually, I think this regulation is also kind of mirroring the regulation for Germany, but they make it more strict, especially when it comes to the time frame from removal for hours for urgent content, and then 24 hours maximum for other misinformation, disinformation. That's not that they consider not urgent. So it's very, I think for the Germany, they have longer time frame, if I'm not mistaken, more than 24 hours. And as well as in Indonesia, in this regulation, they do not consider the size of platform. So for especially when it comes to this time frame, it will be harder to platform who has less or small resources to hire a lot of fact checkers or like to just doing the minimum.
That's an interesting thing to observe when you have regulation and you adapt it to another country and situation and change time frames and things like that. It can mean completely different things. Completely understand that. Chris, I was really intrigued by how you ended your presentation. When you said, hi again, when you said that you might have fact checkers from different perspectives and neutral and more one side of a polarization situation and the other side. And that as first glance seems a little bit strange, because when we talk about fact checking, then we are talking about something true or not true. You can't have different opinions on whether that's true or not. And that seems to highlight again the problem of this kind of distinctions. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, that would be fascinating. What do you learn when you look at these different fact-checking perspectives?
Thank you, Wolfgang. Well, maybe I didn't make my point clear enough when I introduced the last part of my study. I mean, in Hong Kong, as I mentioned, there is quite a few different fact-checking organizations, and some of them have partisan bias. By saying partisan bias, I'm not saying when they do the same topic fact check, they will give you different results. But what I'm saying is they are doing different topics of fact checking. For example, there is a rumor about party A where I'm supporting for party A, so I want to clarify that. But as for rumors or misinformations for party B, which I'm against, I wouldn't do that kind of fact checking. This is what the type of bias I'm talking about. It's mostly about topic selections. And I'm not sure if this kind of phenomenon also exists in other parts of the world, because my study so far only looks at the situation of Hong Kong. Fact-checking organizations are supposed to be, neutral, but in reality, it could be difficult, right? In reality, you can have a partisan bias, but there actually a study conducted by Chinese University Hong Kong scholar. The conclusion is kind of similar to mine. That is the different types of fact-checking organizations in Hong Kong, when they conducting a fact check, they do it professionally. But in terms of topic selections, there are natural bias to them. You know, yeah.
Is when we had the chance to talk with fact-checking organizations here over in Europe and Germany a couple of weeks ago, and one of the issues was that it might be helpful, and some have it already, to have a more step approach. The first one is to assess what kind of statement is that actually? Is that something that can be fact-checked? And that you not only come up with that is true or not true, but that maybe that is misleading, or here there are some arguments that go to this direction. So that's not just about saying that's bluntly false, but giving some context, for example. Do you have similar observations there, or what is your view on that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, fact-checking organizations does not possess a God's-eye perspective. So, and in particular, most of the misinformation, it cannot be judged by true or false. In particular, many of them are, have very complex contexts. Sometimes the use of wording is misleading. Sometimes, the picture could be misleading. So I see Hong Kong Baptist University's fact-checking organization. The answer they provide to any fact-checking is not a true or false answer. In fact, they come up with a paragraph kind of details the problem with certain pieces of information and explain why, in which aspect this is wrong or this is not accurate. So so that's my basic view. We need to provide context and details rather than a simple yes, no, or true or false.
Yeah, and what I find extremely interesting your research is that you look into the effects, which is normally the most important, but also the methodologically most challenging element. And my assumption would be, and if you have a reflection on that, I would be really happy, is that when we talk about effects of misinformation, it might be good to look at different groups of people. If you are really deep into a conspiracy, for example, it will be really hard to have fact-checking making any kind of effect. It's just more convincing you that there are dark powers behind platforms and governments or whosoever you thinking is directed to. But if you are more neutral, then maybe it makes a difference that you have a link there. Even saying someone, not that is false, but some people question whether that is correct or not. Would you agree that there's a more nuanced looking at different groups with their perception is helpful?
Definitely, that's a very important question to ask. I think in the past few years, I did some different studies in Hong Kong and also in mainland China about misinformation's effects, influence on people. And in general, I agree with your view. In particular, there are several typical groups that are vulnerable, very vulnerable to misinformation. One is the disadvantaged group of people with low socioeconomic status. They have lower education. So they have relatively a lower level of media literacy to start with. So it's very difficult to help them to understand what are the features of misinformation. And another group of people who are vulnerable to misinformation is people who are, high on ideological extremes. If you are supporting a certain party or partisanship or a group of people, you have strong identity, then those kind of misinformation tend to have the biggest effect on people. In mainland China, it's about if you have a misinformation about United States government, then Chinese people would be very happy to believe, because it's in line with their preconception. Same thing in Hong Kong, and I think elsewhere in the world. In the United States, political polarization is also deeply intertwined with the issue of misinformation. So partisans are more likely to believe in those kind of inaccurate description or emotionally laden information.
So if we look a little bit to the future, what do you think, after having studied these phenomena and the instruments combating it closely, what are promising avenues that we should follow? What information do we need? What should the academic community provide, like you present your research, to optimize the system? Nurma, what is your take on that? What are promising things and instruments that we might work on in this field?
Yeah, for Indonesia, that I believe that a lot of fact-checking organization, also NGOs, CSOs already working on this issue to increase digital literacy, and then also debunking a lot of information, even though we really need to measure the effectivity of all this approach, because the government itself already spends billion to the effort of digital education, digital literacy program, and also fact-checking program. But actually, for me, especially for now, I don't really know which is the most effective way, or what way that we should take to fight misinformation. But I believe that platform should be included in the discussion, in the working process to really eradicate that, because we thought their participation, it will be hard. And so far we only measured or see or fact check the misinformation in social media, but we never know in Indonesia with social messaging apps, especially with WhatsApp. Like 90% of Indonesians use WhatsApp, and from my experience with my family, I saw a lot of disinformation in those applications in WhatsApp, and there is no one who doing the fact check there, and I think the problem will be there instead of social media, especially for Indonesia.
Yeah, so this evaluation element definitely is something we have to put on the list. And I remember that you mentioned before that transparency, and not only transparency about the actions of the platforms, which is important, definitely, but also transparency about government measures. And that is, I think, something important as well. Chris, what's your take on that? What is our promising future avenues? Is fact-checking, I think fact-checking, if it is nuanced enough, is something. There is a question in the chat that's, again, coming back to the preconceived bias or ideology, and that limits the effect of fact-checking. I think you mentioned that already.
Yeah.
But maybe you can elaborate on that a little as well.
Sure. Well, I think first of all, we need to be realistic about this. I mean, it's just like we now all over the world are living with the pandemic, living with the virus. I think we have to live with misinformation for the rest of our life and our future generations' lives. We cannot get rid of it, right? It will be there. So harsh regulation, it could be one solution, but it cannot cure all the problems. I mean, we need multiple approach to this problem. And on the audience side, I think to foster a healthy fact check culture, it's in line with most of our education philosophy, that is to have a critical eye on all the information we receive, in particular in such an era we live in, that there's massive amount of information we encounter online on a daily basis. So which is true, which is not, or which is partially true, which is partially false. We all need to be having a really critical eye on those. So on the other side, I think platforms may also have a responsibility to, foster fact-checking culture. Just like Facebook could be used as a platform to distribute false information, it could also be a responsible platform to maybe fund or even organize scholars and studies and fact-checking organizations to make their influence more powerful. I mean, they can design algorithm to send fact-checking information to people. To some extent, mainland Chinese companies under government pressure, they are doing this. Big companies like Tencent or Baidu, they all have their fact-checking team, but obviously you can say that there's a political bias to it. But regardless, their fact-checking kind of effort is very powerful. There's a strong presence of Chinese social media of fact-checking information of various kinds, but obviously they don't touch on sensitive political issues. That's something I think platforms can learn from. Some of the Chinese companies practice.
Yeah, that's a lot of things to consider as well. I have some questions from the people listening to our conversation. Maybe we can open it now, and I just we as a panel can see what we can address, and please chime in whenever you find it helpful. And I've also Cherian wanting the word, but I start maybe with one question from the chat that I got a couple of minutes ago. That's from Pirong from Thailand, and her question for all speakers is how to increase platform transparency and accountability, and how could a small country such as Thailand require platforms to create effective complaint mechanisms at a national level when there is only, say, a marketing office without any decision-making power present in the jurisdiction? That's an important question. That's that there is only a sales and marketing office is even true for some very large countries. But of course, it makes a difference how big the market is and how important the platforms view this kind of market. What's your view on that? Any ideas?
Maybe this is my personal opinion, but maybe the government can impose incentive or disincentive in terms of economic when, for example, platform can effectively increase their transparency and accountability. The government can change the or make incentive or in terms of their tax or something, but also this requires the government political will and commitment, because Thailand is very unique, has very unique political structure, in my opinion. So, and where the freedom of expression is a bit limited. So it will, if they ask, or the people of the government ask for more transparency, of course, the government itself will be affected in that terms.
Chris, feel free, if it's not so much about your empirical perspective, but please feel free to give your views as well. So my 10 cents on that is that it can help when national regulators try to copy ideas from other countries, because as I see it, big platforms, it's all about scalability. And if they have the feeling that for Thailand they have to build something completely new, then it is more costly for them to do that. But when you say, I've seen you have created a system there, that would be something that can help here as well. And that would be maybe the first steps to convince them to come up with this kind of thing. And the second thing is you need a powerful person within a company that lobbies for you as a regulator, if you do not have the power to formally request that. But it's an extremely interesting question, I would say, how that is possible, and happy to talk about that Fitrianingrum later on if you're interested. So she's now working with the regulator in Thailand, as far as I know, as a former colleague of mine from Chulalongkorn University. Hello, good to hear from you again, by the way. Other questions from, we had someone wanting the floor, but I don't see the hand anymore. Jerian, please chime in.
Thanks so much, Wolfgang. This more of, I guess, a comment, although I welcome your reactions as well. I think struck by some of the discussions that went before, I think it may be useful to distinguish counter disinformation from fact-checking. They're not the same thing. Because we know from propaganda studies, we know from hate speech research, for example, that very, very effective propaganda, very effective hate campaigns can actually be fueled by purely factual information. And it is really the framing of the facts, the selectivity of the facts that can be very, very powerful, often more powerful than what the Americans call pants on fire lies, right? So, I mean, a typical example would be if you curate factual news stories of immigrants or, unpopular religious minorities involved in sexual offenses or crimes. Those individual stories can be purely true, but simply by selectivity, by framing, you can create what we would certainly call disinformation. So I've always been a bit skeptical about putting our eggs, so many of our eggs into the fact-checking basket. I'm really quite skeptical about the effects in the long term against disinformation.
Thanks very much for this important insight. Anyone wants to comment on that, Chris? Any more questions on that? We had a question sent before. There was one on the EU again, but I'm happy to answer that later on, because good to see what the perspectives from other parts of the world are.
We also had a question provided earlier on, was on the role that social media platforms can play in dismantling state-sponsored disinformation. So for instance, I think Nan in the chat talked about how in Thailand, after doing some research and fact checking, they found that most of the disinformation was actually from government policy or government sources. Yeah, I was wondering how that sort of strikes at a very core issue of interests where the state and maybe platforms don't align. I was wondering maybe Nurma, you might have some thoughts from Indonesia, but also Chris in Hong Kong.
Yeah, thank you, Dev. Maybe I will add some of the data or experience in Indonesia, because I think a few years ago, international community and also Indonesian organization noticed that there were some organized activity in social media in Indonesia where they are known as a buzzer who make engagement and also create a narrative about a certain issue, and some of them are allegedly sponsored by state actors. I will not say state agency, but it's state actors, and from based on the research, it's quite clear that those was true, and actually Facebook then removed those accounts and their activities without noticing or without consultation with the government, under the reason of coordinating the inauthentic activity and engagement. So I think in this sense that actually platform can take part in such activity to reduce fake news or hate speech, but sometimes it's also hard because there we have one case also when one of the government bodies actually requested Facebook to take down a hate speech, but Facebook refused because they don't see any violence factor in those statements or in those accounts. So they use a global context to judge the Indonesian case. So I think, yeah, here of course, social media platforms should be more proactive.
So thanks for that, Nurma. So we have one question from Pauline, and then perhaps Wolfgang, I'll turn to you to maybe give your final take on the Digital Services Act question that we had earlier, and we can maybe end with that. So I think Pauline's question was, perhaps Chris is the best person to take that, which is, do you agree that fact-checking has a limited impact on people with preconceived bias or ideology? And do you think that psychology might be more useful in combating misinformation?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. But fact-checking cannot cure all the problems. And responding to Pauline's earlier question on this, she mentioned when it comes to contentious issues, it wouldn't be able to, fact-checking is not possible, right? But I think we do what we can do. Maybe there are 80% of things that we have factual information that can be fact-checked. The rest of 20%, we try our best, and in terms of population or group differences, we try to influence people that can be influenced first, and then focus on those who are difficult to reach. In misinformation studies, effect studies in academia is very similar to persuasion studies that are popular after the Second World War. When cognitive psychologists are interested in how to change people's attitude. So basically, it's the same question, but the stimuli become different. Early on, it could be political propaganda, but now it's just misinformation. Yeah, I agree. We cannot solve every problem. Yeah, try our best.
Thank you, Chris. I think we're running out of time, but we'll just leave. This discussion has been so great, so I think I'll let Wolfgang have the final word. I think we had the question on the EU's Digital Services Act and how effective it is. I think you already gave your view at the start, but perhaps you may want to like double click a little bit on that. And
yeah, I will
related
make
question,
it. Yeah, I will make it really, really brief. I think the Digital Services Act in that respect is very overrated, but I will give it a chance. That's the very brief answer to that. And a second thing, I believe that what we need, and we are in the progress of setting that up, we need a kind of network of NGOs and also academic observers for DSA implementation. And my take is that this network has had to have arm's length distance, not only to the platform, but also to the European Commission and the national coordinators to really give a fresh perspective on the process. And we hope that we can deliver something, and I'm happy to share the insights we get when we have a discussion like that in a year or two. So back to you, Dev, and many, many thanks. Learned a lot.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. And yeah, I'm sure we could keep this conversation running for another hour at least, but unfortunately, we're going to have to put the pause here. Thank you all, and have a good rest of the day. Thanks for joining. Goodbye.